but we are so happy. We are so happy to have you here today, and I'm going to toss it back to Laura. We are so pleased to have a special guest to do a welcome, and I'm going to pass it over to Laura to introduce the welcome.
All right. So I'm Laura Gonzalez from Miramar College, and I am very pleased to introduce a special welcome today from the president of the San Diego College of Continuing Education, Dr. Carlos Turner Cortez, who is also our SDCCD Chancellor-elect. And he moved things around on his calendar in order to be here today because it was very important to him. Carlos, I will turn it over to you. Thank you for being here.
Professor Gonzalez, and thank you, Professor Patatskill, and all the faculty at the partnering organizations who have joined together to make today's event possible. I think today's event is important, not just because of the cultural significance, because we're recognizing the diversity of our community and the richness in the history, particularly of Asian American and Pacific Islanders, but because this event is one of the first affinity events that is being coordinated district-wide. And I want to applaud those that are involved in our diversity committee work and those that are involved in equity and inclusion work at your campuses for making this linkage. Many of the programs that we bring to our 4 colleges are really valuable programs whose value goes beyond any of those specific institutions. And so I hope as we become more and more familiar with meeting online over the past year, that we will take advantage of future online events such as today's wonderful event with Dr. Ocampo to connect our colleges to one another more thoughtfully and more strategically, because our students and our benefit from these types of experiences. So I'm thrilled to be here today. I want to again applaud everyone for taking time out of their busy schedules to be part of this important event, and look forward to hearing from Dr. Ocampo, our special guest for the hour. And so I'm going to pass it back to Professor Gonzalez, I believe, who's going to set up the agenda for today's workshop.
Thank you. And I'm going to pass it back to Dr. Patatskill.
Thank you both.
Thank you, Dr. Cortez. And again, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Dr. Spadia, for bringing your students, for Deanna coordinating with us, Jamila as well. I'm not sure if Jamila is able to be here today, and then Lisa and Joyce from Dr. Curley and Joyce from CE. I'm very proud and very pleased to have this collaboration event with our featured speaker, Dr. Anthony Ocampo. He is the Associate Professor of Sociology and Provost Fellow at Cal Poly Pomona, as well as the Faculty Director of the California State University Chancellor's Doctoral Incentive Program. He's the author of The Latinos of Asia, How Filipino Americans Break the Rules of Race, and the forthcoming book, Brown and Gay in LA, Queer Sons of Immigrants Coming of Age. He's also the founding editor of the Asian American Sociology series at NYU Press. Dr. Ocampo's research on immigration and race has been cited and or featured in the New York Times, the New Yorker, NPR, NBC, and a number of Filipinx and Latinx media outlets. I am proud to be able to say that we serve on a board together of the Filipino American National Historical Society. He just came on board, and I'm proud to, again, to have him as a colleague. And for him, I am very appreciative and thankful that he's come to do this presentation for Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Without further ado, Dr. Anthony Ocampo. Let's welcome him.
Thank you so much for that incredibly warm welcome. It's so nice to be doing an event for API Heritage Month. I mean, for me, I feel like that's every month. I know it's been a really, really interesting year in which, I don't know about you, but for me, it's just, I've been having a lot of mixed feelings about the fact that this country, the media, seems to care all of a sudden about Asian American people and Asian American Pacific Islander issues. And for a lot of us, we've had no choice to care because we live in communities where there are thriving, dynamic Asian American communities from all different parts of the world. But of course, because, you know, I also have mixed feelings because it feels like a lot of the interest that people have around Asian American issues, Pacific Islander issues, less so, unfortunately. I feel like a lot of this interest is driven by the fact that there's this ongoing string of hate crimes, murders of Asian American folks in the United States. And for me, I feel like these are communities that we should care about even without these tragedies. And so, you know, I just wanted to say that it's been a very, 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 on top of an already peculiar year with the pandemic, with the reckonings on systemic racism. It's been a very peculiar year for Asian American Pacific Islander folks. And I think that that's okay to say out loud. And so I'm here to talk about my work in the field of Asian American studies, particularly Filipino American studies. And I, to be honest, I want to treat today in a very, you know, I'm going to be sharing a lot of content, but I also want today's event, considering that, you know, we're only here for, I guess, 45 more minutes or so. I always like to treat these events that happen virtually as partly, yes, you get to experience and learn about content that you may not have had exposure to. Number two, I always see these Zoom calls, as much as we're not in person and as much as I'd love for all of us to be in the same room, I also look at these as opportunities for connection. So feel free to use the chat. Feel free to message your questions. And ultimately, I want this to be a community. So, you know, I know that these events are going to be ongoing. For me, in a year pandemic, when I haven't been able to see friends or interact with folks in the way that I'm just so accustomed to, as corny as this sounds, these Zoom events where I've got to watch authors or speakers or creators and be in the same room as folks, those folks have become my community in the year of pandemic. And so I'm just so glad that we're able to share this space together. And please think of today as the beginning of a conversation. I don't want today to be the end all and be all of all things Filipino American, because I think that one of the driving forces of my work is that for anybody, Filipino or non-Filipino, there's so much about the Filipino American story that has to teach about the way the world works. And, you know, I feel like there's a lot of lessons to be learned. And so I'm going to share some of those lessons today, if you don't mind. I'm going to share my screen, if that's okay. Cool. Let's see. All right. Let me know. Can you see is everything? Can you give me a thumbs up? Thank you. All right. So, like I said, it's so interesting to be doing this work. I am an author. I identify, took me 4 decades, but finally I feel comfortable identifying myself as a writer. I write stories. I have all these miscellaneous titles of professor, faculty director, but ultimately at the heart of what I do is I consider myself someone that just tells stories, and not just my story. I find opportunities to have sit down conversation with folks to get a sense of what their version of the world is. And for me, I feel like storytelling has been a lifeline in very difficult moments of my life. And so I just want to share a little bit about how I even came to write this book in the first place. So back in the 90s, when I started college, if I don't even know if folks were born yet, but in the 1990s, I spent most of my upbringing, my coming of age happened in a place that was very much that, like, I would compare it to places like National City, Mira Mesa, Chula Vista. I grew up in a neighborhood that was very much the composition of folks in my neighborhood, the composition of folks in my schools was pretty much evenly divided between Filipino American and Latinx. And so in my neighborhood, I grew up in Eagle Rock. This was a neighborhood where, you know, on average, approximately like 20% of the residents in the neighborhood are Filipino American, either immigrants from the Philippines or their children of immigrants. I happen to be a child of immigrants. My parents are from the Philippines themselves, migrated from in the 1980s. And so I grew up in this neighborhood, and very much like in my neighborhoods, in my schools, in the church that we attended, it was very, very easy to see that there were a lot of cultural overlaps between Filipino American folks and other Latinx folks, a lot of whom were Mexican American, some of whom were Salvadoran, Colombian. But growing up in the same neighborhood and attending the same schools, it was very, very easy to see that there were overlaps between our two particular cultural backgrounds. And so I guess the most obvious place that I would see it is if you think about a last name. My last name's Ocampo. I had other Filipino friends whose last names were like Gonzalez, Rodriguez, Torres, and there were always like folks of Mexican American descent or Latinx descent, or who were Latinx identified, who, well, back then they wouldn't say Latinx, but like Latino identified, who shared the same last name. And then over time, we start to see that there were other sort of like building blocks that showed that there was a relationship between our two groups. In addition to our last names, we had overlapping words. So like the thing I'm sitting on right now is in Tagalog would be Celia, but in Spanish would be Silla. The thing that I wear on top of my body is camiseta. If I'm wearing a t-shirt, it'd be a camiseta. It's the same word in Spanish and Tagalog. If my parents went to work, they'd be going to trabajo. If we went to church on Sunday, we'd be going to misa. And so these were, you know, growing up where I grew up, I got to notice that there were all of these overlaps between Latinx and Filipino American communities. So I say this because all of a sudden, when I got to the age of 18 and it was time for me to go to college, I moved to a university where, like I said, my neighborhood was 20% Filipino. And then I moved to a college where there were 20 Filipino Americans in the entire first year class. So I figure for folks that are attending school in San Diego, that like, just imagine just imagine what it would be like to go from a place like Mira Mesa or National City or Chula Vista, where like you see Filipinos everywhere. You see the Filipino grocery store, you see Filipino folks just kicking it on the street. You see like Filipinos attend in your classrooms. Now, all of a sudden go to a place where there was none of that. You know, there was none of that. It was a predominantly white space. And all of a sudden you're in a space where folks like literally are confused about who you are. Like they look at you, they come from a part of the United States where they're not used to seeing folks like you. And so when they look at you, their automatic assumption is like very, very one-dimensional. They're like, oh, you're Asian, right? Even if they have no conception of what Asian means, because they grew up in, I'm literally picking places where my classmates grew up, like North Dakota or Wisconsin or Ohio. They looked at me and they were like, oh, you're Asian. And so it's not that I minded that much that folks would look at me and then impose the label of Asian. Actually, that's not true. I minded a lot. I minded a lot the fact that like folks would look at me and think that they knew who I was based purely off what they categorized me as. And for them, when they said the word Asian, I was very, very clear that they weren't talking about Filipinos, or they know very little about who Filipinos were. In particular, they probably knew very little about the fact that like Filipinos and Latinos had these very, very close historical and cultural connections. And for whatever reason, that first year experience in my college really, really, really bothered me. The fact that folks would just sort of like impose a label on me, it just on a personal level, it rubbed me the wrong way. And so absolutely, I'm seeing Irene said culture shock. It was a culture shock. Whew. I mean, I could spend hours just talking about that culture shock of the first year of college. And so that culture shock really mattered, because the fact that folks didn't understand where I was coming from, the fact that folks were just like assuming things about my identity that I didn't necessarily feel about myself. They were like imposing these narratives and stories about who I was based on the fact that they saw me as Asian. It really, really bothered me. And so it bothered me to the point where I feel like my sense of belonging at the college was very much not there. I felt like folks didn't understand where I was coming from. And so whenever I was in my college dorm or I was in a classroom, as for as much of a loudmouth as I am, I was super, super quiet in that first year because I didn't feel like anything I said was of value to the people that surrounded me. And so for me, I almost felt like I was at the point where I wanted to leave that university and transfer. Like, I still want to go to college. I just didn't want to be there. And by the way, I'm talking about going to. I was at Stanford for undergrad, which is a weird place because it's in the Bay Area, which is like known to be super Filipino, and yet there was like no Filipinos at the university. And so, yeah, it was really effed up. And so, for me, it wasn't until I was in the end of my first year of college, and it wasn't until I met my very first Filipino American studies professor, who I know Dr. Pataxel knows, Dr. Don Mabalan. So at the time, I was an 18-year-old kid in college. I was like, get me the hell out of here. I don't want to be here. Oh my gosh, this is wonderful. I'm seeing people know who Don is. So I was like, get me the hell out of here. I hate it here. None of these people understand me. I just every day feels so incredibly uncomfortable. And it wasn't until I met Don Mabalan, who at the time was not a professor yet. She was a graduate student, and she taught my very first and only Filipino American Studies class that I've ever taken in my whole entire life. And that class, I kid you not, that connection, this is why I care about connection so much. That one-on-one connection with Dawn and that class completely changed my life. I mean, I know people are like, this class changed my life, but like literally taking that class changed the direction of my life. On the first day of class, Dawn said to this group of fellow lost Filipino American students, she said, if you learn nothing else from this class, go get your PhD. And at the time, I was like, what the hell is a PhD? Like, I know that was at the end of the letters of all my professors' names, but I didn't know what it was. And so over the course of that class, I learned that, Filipino Americans, even though we are a community, like this is such an important part of my identity, I learned in that class that there's actually something incredibly wrong with the fact that I could go through my entire K through 12 education and another couple years at university and never once have the word Filipino mentioned in any of my classes. She's the first person that said, hey, there's actually something incredibly wrong about that, because as Filipinos, we've played a very important role in the development of this country for as long as we've been here, which is a very long time. And so it was in that class that I started to see, like, it was like a mindset shift where I started to see that, like, wow, like Filipino American history, Filipino American community issues, my Filipino American family, those are all fodder for intellectual discussion. I used to think of like school as like, whatever I do in school is one thing. What I do with my family and my community is like outside that and separate. Professor Babalan was the first one who said, no, absolutely, Filipino topics belong in the context of a classroom. And that, for me, having grown up 18 years of my life, even though I had a strong sense of Filipino identity, having grown up 18 years of my life where I wasn't used to that, it took, to be honest, it took a very long time for me to see Filipino American stuff as worthy of study, just because of like, there's so many messages that we get that Filipinos don't matter, right? Which is, in the field of Asian American issues, it's even the case in those spaces where sometimes I felt like Filipinos And you could say the same thing about Indian Americans or Pacific Islanders, but I felt like Filipinos sometimes got the short end of the stick. And what I mean by that is when folks think about the word Asian American, again, they're not thinking about Filipino Americans. And so I feel like I really have to trace my writing of this book to this one person who decided to like take the time to invest in me and tell me that like my thoughts had value, my contributions mean something, and the stuff I write can actually like all these essays that I'm making you write for class, all these thoughts that you're having, at some point, if you keep working at this writing, you can eventually write stuff that other people are going to read, and hopefully it'll affect those people in similar ways. And so yeah, so that's when I guess those were the seeds of when I decided I was going to become a writer, even though I didn't say those words back then. Yeah, that's when I decided, like, reading stuff, like assembling sentences in a particular way that centers our experiences, that will do something similar to what Dawn Babalan was doing for me. So yeah, that's like my starting point. I feel very indebted to her. Unfortunately, she passed away a few years ago at a very young age. And so even though she has like several lifetimes of accomplishments under her belt, it was just incredibly sad that she passed away. So I feel like in a lot of ways, every event I do, I feel the need to mention her because I wouldn't be here if it weren't for her. So anyway, you'd be surprised. I'm talking to a group in San Diego. You know, you see Filipino Americans all the time. I see the names in this room, and I'm just assuming that a lot of the folks in this room are also Filipino Americans. But what's funny is that sometimes I'll be asked to give this talk like Ohio or other parts of the country where folks know nothing. And so I feel the need to like give a little bit of background. So there are 4 million Filipino Americans in the United States, which blows people's minds sometimes because they're just not aware that there's that many. Of course, the big bulk of these folks are concentrated in California. And Filipinos, this is another factoid that folks are shocked by, but in California, Filipino Americans are the largest Asian American group. Nationally, they're the second largest Asian American group. I know that, yes, exactly what Dr. Pataxil said. Filipinos are the largest Asian American group. On a national level, we're number 2 behind Chinese Americans. Sometimes I'll see some statistics that say that Indian Americans are number 2. And I get a little bit confused because those statistics, what they often do is they just erase people who are multiracial. And for anyone that knows the Filipino American community, we have a lot of multiracial folks in our community. And so if you include those folks, which you should, Filipinos are the second largest group in the United States, first in California. But, and it's also important to note that this term Asian American, even though we use this in everyday discourse, it's something that emerged in the late 1960s and 1970s. A lot of people think that this term has always been around, but in reality, Asian American identity was a social construction. So to bring in the whole sociology part, there are a bunch of folks of Chinese descent, Japanese American descent, Filipino American descent, activists in the 1960s that said, hey, our numbers are small, but we got to fight for our civil rights. Let's rally under this umbrella of Asian American. Oddly, over the past half century, even though Filipinos were a central part of the Asian American movement and Asian American identity, Fred Cordova, who's the founder of the Filipino American National Historical Society, along with Dr. Dorothy Cordova, they always talk about Filipinos as quote unquote forgotten Asian Americans. And so before I go on, I just want folks to chime in the chat or raise your hand. If you've ever feel like the term Asian has excluded or not included Filipinos. I just want to get a sense of the room. And if the answer is no, that's totally okay.
Looks like we have a question or a comment from Rochelle.
Yes.
Go ahead and unmute.
where you at?
Roselle, would you like to unmute?
Hey, Rosal, you're up. Your hand is up. Go ahead.
Maybe we'll go back to Roselle.
Okay. Yeah. Or Rosal, you could. I'm happy to read it in the chat. Cool. So I'm just gonna keep going because I know that there's some folks in the chat that have chimed in, but all right. So as you can see from the chat, and if you don't have the chat feature open, I'm just gonna read some of the responses. So some people say excluded. For me, and someone said included. Another person said, yes, I think the term Asians include Filipinos. Someone said excluded. Carl said excluded at times, included at times, included. Growing up Filipina in a white town in the border region, I felt much closer to the Latinx category than Asian. I only say no because I grew up in Mira Mesa and have had the privilege to know the Filipino community. Someone said, I always thought Filipino was included in Asian American, but there are times when it's considered by some to be not part of it. And so this is great. I think that like the mishmash of answers in here pretty much indicates a lot of the same feelings that I was having when I was starting this research. And so I kind of started with this, a silly research question, which I think some of you that think of Filipinos as included in Asian American, you might be like, oh, this research question is a little bit silly, but just for the purpose of like thinking through the sense of belonging of Filipinos within the Asian American umbrella. And I think this is an important question because when we think about Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, we are so quick to say that. But the reality is that there's like over 50 ethnicities, language groups, etc., of different socioeconomic backgrounds, different regions of Asia, different regions of the country. And so the reality is even if those folks are all included under the API umbrella, the reality is not everyone is going to have a sense of belonging or relationship to that term Asian American to the same degree as everybody else. And when you think about social movements, when you think about community engagement, when you think about community belonging, it's really important to like ask the tough questions about who feels like they belong and who doesn't. And Filipino Americans, in my experience, in what I was reading, and in whenever I would talk to folks, it was always the case that it resembled what was going on in the chat, which was like a super mixed bag of answers, right? Go to any Facebook post or Twitter post or Instagram post where people are talking about where Filipino Americans fit, and just spend some time reading the comments because folks got real opinions. And so as a sociologist, I was really interested in mitigating this puzzle, in part because this was something that I experienced. And so I've always been interested in this question about Filipinos being really Asian. And there's a story that I wanted to share that sort of underscores why I felt this way. And for those of you that have read my book, or at least the beginning, this might sound a little bit familiar. So when I was at UCLA finishing up my PhD, which PhD is nice in some respects. You get to read and write and spend your time thinking about issues. One thing that's not very fun about a PhD is that while all your friends are out in the workforce, like working, like actual jobs where they get paid, as a PhD student, you're not really getting paid. So it's like, imagine me, I'm in my 7th year of grad school. All of my friends from college are like, doing their thing about like starting families and buying homes and like doing adulting things. And here I was still in school 7 years after I finished undergrad. Nothing wrong with that, but I was kind of broke. There's this, my friend who's a professor now at Brown in the East Coast, we have this on our Facebook page. It's private, so you can't see it, but on one of our Facebook albums in my 7th year, we have a picture of us going to the ATM because we're hungry and we want to get El Pollo Loco. So we go to the ATM at Wells Fargo. We try to pull out a 20 so we can go eat at at El Pollo Loco in Westwood. And when we go there, we don't even have enough money in the bank to pull out to eat El Pollo Loco. So we take a picture of like the screen and it says savings $0, checking -$2.14. And so this is the background that I'm sharing because it was that same year when I saw this flyer at UCLA in my building. It said, alcohol study. Do you drink alcohol regularly? Are you Asian American? And I thought, yes and yes, right? So I've been known to have a drink or two, and Philippines is in Asia. So yes, I'm Asian American. So I saw this and I thought, this is great. This is going to be like the easiest money that I'll be able to make. I called up the study coordinator. I said, hi, I'd be interested in participating in your alcohol study. And, you know, I could really use $200. So everything was going great. I was going to participate in the study until I mentioned in the call that I was Filipino. And that's when everything went downhill. She said, I'm sorry, you don't qualify for the study because we can only have Chinese, Japanese, and Korean participants. And I was like, well, why? Like, it says Asian Americans. And she said, well, we need a genetically similar sample. And so I was obviously pissed because I was losing out on my $200 and free drinks. But more importantly, I was pissed because who was this person to tell me that Filipinos don't belong in the Asian American category? I was also mad because in my mind, I was like, this is a study being conducted at UCLA. You're developing studies for the purpose of perhaps producing medicine, perhaps producing treatment programs, perhaps producing outreach programs, and you're explicitly excluding Filipinos, and then you're going to go out into the world and whatever product you develop is going to be marketed for Asian Americans. And I just thought, wow, that is so messed up. And so I like sharing this example because it's an example of how there are these moments where Filipinos are made to feel like they don't belong. And those moments have serious implications for other things beyond just identity. Because a lot of folks will just be like, oh, who cares? It's just identity. It's not a big deal. But here's an example of how identity can have an impact on things like research studies, in the realm of politics. It could have an effect there, like who gets elevated to be a political candidate or a leader. For my Filipino American friends who are in the field of the creative field, whenever they try to pitch a show, whenever they try to audition for roles, they're always told, you're not Asian, so sorry, we can't cast you for this movie or for this show. So it happens across the board. And so so I just got to thinking, like, let me just think about this question, but instead of thinking about the times when Filipinos are made to feel like they don't belong, let me just ask Filipinos themselves what they think. And so I looked at a survey where they did a like a questionnaire. They asked people of different Asian ethnicities, what is your racial background? I wanted to see what Filipinos would say. And what I saw is that, you know, when they asked Chinese Americans, when they asked Vietnamese Americans, Korean Americans, and this was conducted in Los Angeles, by the way. When they asked these groups, what is your racial background? All of them chose Asian. But when you ask Filipinos, only 45% of Filipinos said that they checked the Asian box. And so for me, I was, you know, I had a suspicion why, but as a sociologist, of course, I couldn't just be like, I know why. Like, you have to actually like go out and collect data. I wanted to understand what was going on. And so what I did, as any sociologist does, is that we look at survey data. But for me, I also wanted to just get out in the field and talk to actual Filipino Americans. So I went to, like, I'm from LA, so I did most of the study in LA. And so it doesn't necessarily generalize to every part of the country. Like, what happened in LA doesn't necessarily happen, is not necessarily what happens in like Las Vegas or or New Jersey or Hawaii, but it's okay. Like, we're gonna learn a little bit something. And so what I did is I went to different neighborhoods in Los Angeles. I went to Eagle Rock, which is a middle-class neighborhood with mostly Filipino, Latinx, and white. Went to Carson, which is also a lot of Filipinos, but Filipino, Latinx, and African American. I just wanted to get folks from different neighborhood contexts to see what they would say. I interviewed men and women. I interviewed queer, straight. I interviewed folks of like, they were all young adults, but people that had had different experiences in school. So some folks that went, high school, community college, were still in community college. I had other folks that were finishing undergrad. I had basically a mishmash of folks. And so this is what I found. What I found is that when it came to talking about identity, Asian American identity, or like racial categories, they were, instead of think of it as like some box you check on a form, in reality, race was more of like these categories were like a constellation of different factors that came into play. So yes, it mattered what you look like, but it also mattered like how you dressed, what your hair texture was like, the way you spoke, like if you had an accent, what else? The color of your skin, the type of slang you would use. All of these factors that go beyond just the checkbox on a form played a role in how people categorized folks racially. When it came to identity for Filipinos, it largely depended on the context. So Filipinos would talk about how their sense of Asian American identity, kind of like what someone said in the chat, it depends. And there was one person I interviewed who said, when I'm in K-Town, I feel like I'm super Asian, but when I'm in East LA, all of a sudden I blend in with Latinos, right? So that's like, what, a 20-minute drive away from each other, and all of a sudden identity can change. So it just underscored the idea that like your identity can shift depending on the context. But what was universal across the board was that for everybody that grew up in LA, for them, race mattered in their everyday life. So it's something that affected their relationships, their, like, where they went to school, the way teachers treated them, et cetera, et cetera. So back to the question of like, why, like, what's going on with Filipinos? I like showing the answer of one of the young women that I spoke with, who in the book I call Leah. When I asked her, like, do you think Filipinos, like, do you have a good sense of like Asian American identity? And she said, actually, I feel like Filipinos are much closer culturally with Latinos. We were colonized by Spain for over 300 years. And so we're more Latin than Asian culturally. And then she said something that I heard time and time again from folks that I interviewed. She said, Filipinos are the Mexicans of Asia. And here she was, how many of you in your lives, in your previous, before today, have ever heard something to this effect of like Filipinos are like the Latin Asians, or the Latinos of Asia, or the Mexicans of Asia? We were all colonized by Spain, like some sort of phrasing that like lump people in. So I see some hands up. I see some folks have never heard this. Some folks are like, yes, I've heard this. Totally not hard not to, living close to the border. So yeah, again, I love how the chat is just like underscoring the confusion that is being Filipino in the United States, because it's this constant question of like, what the hell is going on? So like, yes, there was a lot of Filipinos that some of whom were like, oh, I haven't really heard that, but a lot of them said, yeah, I've actually seen the way that Filipinos are often like spoken about when it, like, in conversation with Mexican Americans and other Latinos. So sometimes she was saying it as a joke. Some people were using it in different ways, but the point is that's something that exists. And that's very unique compared to other Asian Americans. And so the question for me is like, why are people saying this? Why is this coming up time and time again with folks? And if you do a little digging about Filipino American history, you'll find that like a lot of it has to do with the colonial legacies of Spain and the United States. Just a little bit of a factoid: Philippines was a colony of Spain for over 300 years. but the people that actually ran the Philippines from the Spanish Empire were housed in Mexico City. So arguably, the influence of the Spanish in the Philippines is actually more Mexican influence. That's up for debate. But yeah, Philippines, there was 300 years. There's this phrase that we use in the Philippines. Filipinos spent 300 years in the convent and 50 years in Hollywood. And it's just a way to quickly summarize the fact that like, there's a lot of stuff there's a lot of impact, cultural impact that the Spanish had on the Philippines. Things like Spanish words in the Tagalog language and other Filipino languages. There's like Spanish last names. And of course, what's the big thing? On the lower right-hand corner of the screen, you can see is the impact of Catholicism on the Philippines. That's something that's those traits are stuff that resembles what's happening in Latin America. And of course, with the 50 years in Hollywood, English was a language of instruction in the Philippines. Philippines has been exposed to American pop culture for forever. And of course, the relationship of the Philippines and the United States, that colonial relationship. And so all of these factors come into play for why Filipinos feel like they're different from other Asian Americans. And the thing that we got to note here is that the way people conceptualize Asian American is antithetical to the way Filipinos conceptualize their identity. And so that is where the issue is that the way that Asian American identity is so narrowly socially constructed, it's done in a way that doesn't necessarily include and encapsulate all the diverse experiences that Filipino Americans have. And again, it's not just Filipino Americans. This also applies to Chamorros, Tongans, Fiji, like Pacific Islander groups as a whole. It applies to South Asians, Pakistani, right? It's still the case that when we think of Asian, we're often thinking of what the people I interviewed said are the big three. So Korean, Japanese, and Chinese. So I say this because it's just in the spirit of, I'm very much inspired by the work of Black feminist thinkers. And so I mentioned that Filipinos are on the margins of Asian American identity because with anything that you try to study, with anything that you try to do, with any event that you're trying to hold, it's always important to ask the questions, who's excluded, whose voices are not centered, and in what ways can we incorporate those voices to be more inclusive of everybody that should be served by a particular community or category. And so one thing I'll say is that I want to just sort of pause here, but the way that Filipinos' sense of like dissonance with Asian American identity that emerged in 4 different arenas of identity. It emerged in when Filipinos talked about what they look like, their phenotype, language, religion, and social networks. And so I just want to close by sharing a quote from one of the people that I interviewed who kind of captures everything that I was trying to study about how race is a flexible concept. Caesar, who is from Carson, California, he said, if we're in a Hispanic place, people assume I'm Mexican. It happens a lot to Filipinos, especially to my cousin. We just look Mexican. He just looks Mexican, but he's Filipino. We both have that Spanish influence. We both have that Spanish blood. Sometimes we look Hispanic or Latino. And one thing I'll say here before I open up to questions is that Filipinos don't actually technically have a lot of Spanish blood, but again, this goes to the whole like mythology of racial categories, is that this narrative about Filipinos having Spanish blood comes up because of these cultural overlaps that Caesar sees between Filipinos and Mexican Americans in the neighborhood that he lives in. So I'm going to stop there just because I want to, open it up to questions and convo. But thank you so much for listening. I'm excited to keep the convo going. So I'm happy to answer any questions that folks have.
Dr. Carlos Cortez has a question. It's in the chat.
Yes. Oh, yes, it's a census question. Yes. So the question, I'm going to read it, Dr. Cortez. The US Census started including Latinos in their count in 1980. Every 10 years, the US has established new categories to make sense of Hispanics, quote unquote. By 2000s, the Latinos no longer constituted a race, but rather an ethnicity within larger racial categories. Have you studied how the census has classified Filipinos? Yes, I have. And what's interesting about this question is that it was a serious question for the Census Bureau about what to do with the Filipinos, right? In the early days of sociology, you'll read like sociology books from like the 1930s and 20s. They'll have books that are like trying to understand minority groups in the US. And there's this one called Spanish groups, like this is, you know, Spanish groups in America or something like that. And it talks about Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Mexicans, and Filipinos, right? So it just is an indication that people didn't know what to do with the Filipino group for a while. And in the 1960s, when and I'll use the term Hispanic because back then that's what they used, but like Hispanic bureaucrats, media folks like journalists, activists back in the 1960s and 70s, in the same way there was no like Asian category, there wasn't really like a pan Latino category or Hispanic category. That emerged fairly recently as well. And there was a big question of like, what do we do? What do we call the category? Because at one point they used to call it Spanish surname people, which would include Filipinos because of last names like mine. But what ended up happening is that the people that were in charge of creating census categories, they decided to not include Filipinos in the Hispanic category because they thought it would cause fighting with Chinese Americans that were coming up with the census categories at that time. At the time, if you think about what was happening, there were Filipino American activists that were generally more middle class, college going, that were doing the whole Asian American identity thing. But at the same time, in places like the Central Valley, there were Filipino Americans that were uniting with Mexican American farm workers and creating an identity around their shared labor market position, right? And so in theory, there were these two like Filipinos joining up with a larger category things going on. It just so happened that Filipinos ended up in the Asian category. Diana has a question. What is Latinx? So, you know, historically, I'm sure you've all heard the word Latino or Latina. Latinx is a identifier that's been advanced by queer, non-binary folks of you know, whose descent is drawn to Mexico, Latin America. And it's a way to sort of reject the gender binary that a lot of folks don't necessarily fit into. So Filipinx has emerged as a cousin of the Latinx category. And like all new identifiers, new categories are super, super empowering and also anger a lot of people. So that's the whole point, right? Is that these new categories are meant to stir up rigorous debate about how categories include and exclude folks. Susie, who decides which race? Who decides about the racial categories? That's a really great question. A lot of times who decides the racial categories are not people of color. You know, the Hispanic category was a government designation that said, these people are gonna be Hispanic, right? And it's often the case that like people of color have to do the heavy lifting to make sure that the identifier that's used is done in a way that's like precise. It's not precise, it's all messy, but like that's done in a way that serves the purposes, the needs of those groups. Because it's often done like super arbitrarily. Like race is super messy. Like before the 1960s, before people were advocating for their civil rights around racial categories, you should just do a little bit of digging and you'll see there's so many messed up categories like that people used, and they would use racial categories to try to demonstrate which groups were superior and which groups were inferior. So racial categories have a very, very harmful history. And it's fairly recently that we're trying to take hold of that history and use these identifiers for the better. I'm going to get to this question of Doc. Could you comment on the relationship between ethnicity and race in the context of the way you've presented? Yeah, so Doc, thanks for this question, right? I'm throwing out terms like ethnicity and race. If I was to walk outside and just go chit chat with folks, most people would sort of conflate ethnicity and race, right? And that's totally, I think that's totally okay. I think that in the world of academia, we tend to think about ethnicity as like national origin categories: Mexican, Filipino, Chinese, Taiwanese, Indian, Pakistani, and then race as the umbrella categories like Asian, Black, White, Latinx, right? Of course, those are like academic definitions of that. But the way things play out outside academia, it's a lot more messy. So, Rissel, let me get to this question. There are so many Filipinx artists that talk about this in their work. It would be so awesome to pair sociologists with artists. So much is made from feelings. It is such a crazy experience to see it connect to history, sociology. So interesting. I'm glad you said that, Rizal, because I have been I wrote a book. It's kind of academic. It's sociology at the heart of it. But I've been pretty floored whenever I've been reached out to by like an artist, like visual artists or music artists or documentarians, like filmmakers, and once a choreographer, like a dancer, they like made art based off some of the stuff in the book, which I'm like super flattered by, because no one ever, like in academia, no one ever thinks anyone will read anything you write. And so the fact that like folks are actually like creatively employing the book ideas to do cool art, that's super fun to me. So thank you, Rizal. I'm so glad that you shared that. I feel I have a lot of feels about this work, because most days I'm like this works, no one cares. But days like this where I realize there's a lot of people who care. So thank you for sharing that. Jay, I want to get to this question. Have you ever analyzed situations where including Filipinos as Asian American was a way to undermine efforts to increase diversity? Ooh. For example, in some areas of STEM, Filipinos are underrepresented, but some disagree, because in this instance, they would conveniently categorize Filipinos as Asians, which is a group that is not underrepresented. Jay, you gotta meet this physicist. He's like the only Filipino American physics professor in like America. He is at UC Riverside. His name is Flip. Like that's actually his name, like Flip. He's a physics professor at UCR, and I have seen him write fire, like articles that will like set the world on fire. Oh shoot, where? Jay, I'm sorry. Where are you? Are you in
He's here at Miramar, so we're blessed to have an astronomy physics.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to mention that too, but yeah.
Cool.
I teach at Miramar. And I'm like, I think when I got my PhD, I was like the third Filipino astrophysicist in the country or in the world. I don't know.
You know what? I'm going to rewind and say, I think that Flip mentioned that he was one of the only in his subfield of physics. So I don't want to like mischaracterize his words, but Flip, and it's so funny that you've mentioned that he's in physics, because he has spent a lot of time thinking through this question about how Filipinos are like completely absent in STEM fields. Not completely. I'm being hyperbolic, but you know, relative to other Asians, they're like, where are the Filipinos? My partner's a chemist, so like I get it. But he's been trying to be like, yo, NSF, NIH. Sorry, I'm trying to find the article where he did. I can't find it, but he's like NSF, NIH, all of these science orgs are like totally forgetting the fact that Filipinos like are not represented in these fields, and that's really a problem. And not just Filipinos, but like also Southeast Asian groups as well. Like these organizations that advance the trajectories of minorities in science just conveniently erase Filipinos, which makes it even worse because you can't even identify that there's a problem. Jay, that's so cool. Thank you for I'm so like cool. Filipino in physics. I never took physics in high school, but in part because I didn't think Filipinos could do science. Like I just didn't have any witness. I didn't witness. Like that's why I mentioned Don so much, because Don, like the ability to see someone that looked like me in the front of the classroom was just like weird and in a good way. And it really reshaped my experience and what I thought was possible. So in a lot of ways, I feel like every time I meet someone that's in science, I'm like, I need to connect with you just because, you know, you're doing the same thing for other Phil-Ams in psych. So
yeah, we're lucky to have them. There was another question, speaking of fields, from Selva. It was sent to me. How many social professors are you aware of at community colleges compared to UC, CSU, or private institutions in terms of that interact with you?
I'm sorry. Could you repeat that question?
Sorry, let me pull it up again. Or Sal, if you'd like to ask it and make sure I'm asking it correctly. It says, where'd it go? How many Filipino faculty at the community college versus the CSU and UC or private institutions that you may interact with in the sociology field, Dr. Ocampo?
Yeah, gosh, that are Filipino?
Yes, I think that's what his question is.
You know, I have been super lucky to have connected with a lot of Filipino American professors at community colleges around the country. So I've been in Washington and Glendale, which is near where I'm from, Honolulu, in New York, colleges there. And I love those convos because I feel like that is where I get a lot of like the most rigorous questions and like grapplings with the idea. And I would say the same thing about folks at the Cal State. Like I love giving talks for those communities because I just feel like the work it just lands in a particular way that's just super interesting. It makes like super interesting convo. And so to be honest, I think the majority of the talks that I do are like Cal State, Community College, and then UC, you know, some UCs, because they have also, depending on the campus, a large Filipino populations. But then I also end up doing talks for the student organization, Filipino American student organizations at different places, at Illinois, Boston, and I know this wasn't asked, but like what's always weird about doing those events is like that really, like I'm really happy to do them, but I'm also really upset that like my talk with those students will probably be the only time that they have Filipino American content in their entire college careers. And that sucks, you know. They feel like they should have more options to explore that besides like a guest speaker.
So Joyce Almirio from College of Continuing Ed has a question.
Hi, Dr. Ocampo.
Hi.
There I am. I wanted you to talk a little bit about the model minority myth and how Filipinos, well, I can just tell you from my experience, I was not a good student in school. I was very mediocre at best. And my high school, during my high school year, my senior year of high school, I had like 2 Ds on my report card, and they were in science and in math. So right there already, I'm I'm breaking the stereotype. But I was also a very quiet student. I didn't complain. I just kind of kept to myself. Neither of my parents went to college. So, you know, our folks didn't come, we weren't the best of the best from the pool of Filipinos that were immigrating to the United States, as some of those past migrations have been. So we were not those folks. And so I struggled a lot because of those things, and how, for me, the model minority myth has done nothing for me. You know, I know people say, well, it's a good thing. No, it hasn't been a good thing for me, because I was quiet and I followed the rules, but because I was also, struggling in silence, because I didn't know how to ask for help, it really put me in a terrible situation where I basically pretty much kind of gave up in high school, and only to redeem myself at a community college for like 4 years because I messed up in high school. But please talk about that, because those assumptions we make about our Filipino students or Asian students, it can really hurt us. And so
Yeah. Yes. And I think, Joyce, you you have captured the multifaceted. Is it allowed to, can I curse on this? The multifaceted.
Okay with me.
Yeah, multifaceted fucked upness of the model minority myth. I'll tell you the history. So we all know that in World War II, Japanese Americans were interned, right? They're just hundreds of thousands were removed from their homes and their communities. And there was a time in which I think that some Asian American groups thought, okay, if I'm just a model minority, I keep my head down, I just work hard, then this won't happen again. Japanese internment. But later on, the model minority identity became a tool of neoconservative people to undermine the efforts of Black and Latinx folks fighting for civil rights. So this idea that like it was a select group of Asians that were migrating to the United States after 1965 that on average were more selective. On average, not everybody, but on average are more selective than other immigrant groups. And then like white neoconservatives were like, hey, Black people, hey, Mexicans, like, look at this group Asian, they can get their shit together, why can't you? So it was used in a very malicious way. But I think that in the way that it was used, of course, there's certain characteristics of the model minority myth that even folks of Asian descent found appealing and would embrace, like, oh, being good in school, being able to work hard, like those are all traits that like on paper sound like they're good traits. But what's a major problem is that for a lot of Asian American spaces and communities, in order to have a sense of belonging or to be seen as a legitimate Asian, you had to have fit that model minority stereotype. And if you didn't, it caused significant like stress, emotional harm, psychological harm. And so you actually see your experience, Joyce, I've dug a little bit on research of other Asian American groups, and it's often the case that like Asian American folks that don't fit the model minority stereotype not only have a difficult time already with whatever they're facing in their school lives, but on top of that is the added stress of feeling like they don't feel legitimately part of their group. For Filipinos that like in Eagle Rock and Carson, where Filipinos were the predominant Asian group, that model minority stereotype ended up becoming like the litmus test for who's quote unquote really Filipino in some spaces, which for Filipinos that didn't fit that trajectory ended up being a harmful term. So I'd be super happy if the term model minority gets like if it ever like I'd be happy to participate in the like destruction of that term in any way that I can, because it just it does nothing except reinforce the fact that like you have to perform in order to belong, which is already inherently messed up. And I think that it doesn't serve anybody, even for the people that fit the model minority stereotype. It advances the false narrative that like your acceptance in this country and in communities is conditional on whether you fit some sort of like labor standard in school or in the workplace. And that's really, really inherently messed up. Thank you for sharing that, Joyce. I appreciate that.
Yes, thanks. We have another minute or two in terms of questions. We figured we'd have about 10-15 minutes for questions, and we're about 10:44. I know that the class, sociology class might end about 10:45 or 11, but we have the space until 11. But at the same time, we want to honor people's commitments if they do have to leave. Okay, thanks, Marilyn. So if Marilyn just said that it's okay if it doesn't fit within the time frame. But any other questions, any other thoughts? Doc Rivera has his hand up.
Dr. Ocampo, hello, yes. Just want to say, just add voice and energy to, yeah, man, this work, your work is essential. Thank you so much for choosing and struggling through the journey that you're in. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Oh, thank you. There was a lot of times when I thought that it would never happen. So I really appreciate those are the things that keep me going, just because there's nothing in the world telling you that studying Filipinos is a lucrative thing to do. So
one of the thoughts that you prompted in and drew out of me is how you're, for lack of better expression right now, you're the thick line of connection that you make between the concepts that you share in the focus of the Filipino Asian frame, I'm going to call it framework, space, maybe, to the macro picture of all those related issues. In that way, I'm wondering if you have any comments or suggestions as to bottom line, contemporary, immediate kinds of actions and attitudes that people should have now. Because in a way, you have really kind of busted open the box on, for example, what is race, and at a new level of how we ought to be dealing with it. And in my view, based on what I've known of seen of social change, we are evolving as a world to the kinds of concepts you have brought forward. And I'm wondering what you would say about that in relation to anything.
Yeah, I think an immediate thing, if I was an instructor, one thing I could think about is, let me look at the content that students read, and is it one that's reflecting voices that I think are important, right? In a typical race class, I can't tell you how many times I've seen a syllabus on a race and ethnicity class where they only mention the relationship between African Americans and whites, and how for Californians it's an important part of the story, but it's incomplete, And so I think about just airtime and content. So just trying to think about I do this constantly. I look at whatever the topics that I'm speaking on or the classes that I'm teaching, and I think who is missing that shouldn't be missing. And a lot of times it means like, okay, I need to include the perspective of trans folks of color. I need to include the perspectives of Black women, the perspectives of Salvadorans, because a lot of stuff is focused on Mexican Americans. I need to bring in more stuff about Pacific Islanders. And sometimes when you do that, you're you're gonna rely on, you know, in the class context, let's say like a lot of professors, they rely on like published works, like books and articles. But considering you're tapping into communities that don't have the same access to those forms of intellectual production, it's going to be on you to think about like, okay, maybe there's like some poetry, or there's an Instagram account, or there's like TikToks that are doing the work in ways that academia is still not, like they're too slow to incorporate. So I think that just being open about what counts, who counts as intellectual production, and what counts as intellectual production would be like a a change that can be effected like right after this talk ends.
Cool. And if there's somebody else that has a question now, I will hold back my next question just so that others can do what they need to do, want to do. But if no one does, then please call on me.
Just maybe a quick question on your next forthcoming book, speaking of access to publications. Anything that you'd like to say on it for in regards to us looking forward to it in the future?
Oh my gosh, I'm like literally, when I'm not at these events, that's what I'm trying to do. Here it is, just trying to finish it. Yeah, just writing this thing. But
and so maybe a couple of years. How long you think?
2022. So it's
2022.
It was due in June, which is 3 weeks away, so that's not happening. So I'm turning it in August, and then it takes like about a year, a little less than a year, for things to become like a physical book. So I will keep you posted. You'll be one of the first to know.
Thank you. Doc, did you want to ask your question, or anybody else?
Yeah, I'll wait to see if anybody else, and then please call on me. Shall I go?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So intellectual production, that phrase, that comment opens my mind to wondering if you would be able to identify a theory of human nature, a theory of social change, or the combination. I hear some critical theory in you as part of the framework, and I'm looking to, I hear some progressive stuff too, and then I'm looking to, so how does that impact what you see as a framework for human development impacts in the context of what you have shared?
Yeah, you know, oh wow, you know, that's a big question. I think that I don't know what it was, but I've always been so drawn to Black feminist theory. So I don't mention Black feminist theory explicitly in the writing of this book. Whenever I give a talk, the sort of tenets of Black feminist theory, which is the idea, if you think about, like, yes, it's centered on Black women, but it's the larger point is that if you anchor your perspective on folks that are at the margins of the margins, the way that those folks will help you conceptualize what's happening in society will probably be the most accurate mirror of what's going on in society. I really take that to heart in everything that I do. If you could just imagine who is the most excluded person whenever you're thinking through a topic, and what does that topic look like from the perspective of that most excluded person, that's going to yield more insights than going to say like the usual suspects. So that's, you know, whenever in my free time, I'm very drawn to like writings by Audre Lorde and Keeanga Yamada Taylor, Tressie McMillan Cottom, Kimberly Crenshaw, Patricia Hill Collins. Those have been really integral to the way I think about these issues, more so than like theories of immigration or race sometimes. So if I mean anyone, like, this is a big buzzword these days, but you know, any like intersectionality is probably the driving force of my thinking and work.
Absolutely. Okay, maybe we'll take one last question because we're at almost 10:55, not quite, but close to that. If anyone has another question, please feel free to either put in the chat or unmute yourself. On one note, Anthony or Dr. Ocampo, you and both our College of CE president are next to be chancellor of our district also. His field of study included Black feminist theory. So,
Awesome.
we are happy to have had him here with us today and happy to have had the students here today and the professors. Any closing comments or any last question? I see you unmuted your picture, Carlos. Anything you'd like to say as we close?
I just think the intersectionality of Black women's studies and all ethnic studies are all liberation struggles. Anyone who's done this work appreciates the foundational work that African American womenist and feminist scholars did to lay the foundation for subsequent struggles. And, just as to the core of the progressive political movement in this country, and in many ways are the core of the ethnic studies and the feminist movements in our community college and research universities. So, but thank you, Dr. Ocampo. It's been such a pleasure to have you here. I learned so much and great insights, and I believe our community did as well. Thank you. I didn't mean to jump in here. I was just grateful for the opportunity. Thank you.
Oh yeah, of course, of course. I just wanted to shamelessly plug that one of the books that has been a go-to for me whenever, you know, we're living in tough times, and sometimes my way of coping with it is diving into a little bit of history among folks that had much more difficult times, and a lot of times this has been the work of Black women. And so yeah, I just want to plug this as like for anyone that's like at square one that just wants to see something. I highly recommend this book that I shared, How We Get Free by Kianga Yamada Taylor. It's just a fabulous entree into this framework of thinking. So
okay, on that note, many thank yous in the chat. Thank you again for bringing your students. Thank you, Dr. Cortez, for staying and doing our welcome. Thank you for the co-collaborators at College of Continuing Education, City College, Miramar College, and San Diego Community College District. And my indebtedness goes to you, Anthony. Thank you so much, Dr. Ocampo, for being here. And we hope to have you maybe back again in the future. Any closing remarks again, Lisa, Deanna, Marilyn, Laura, G, that you would like to say? Thank you all for collaborating with us. Joyce, anybody else I am missing?
This was great. Thank you so much, Dr. Ocampo.
Oh,
Thank you.
Thank you. I wish I could be in the same space. I mean, I just love like the chit chats after. So another day, huh?
Thank you.
We'll have to have you back again in the future when your next book comes out, if not sooner.
And keep writing. We do read it. We do read it. Keep writing.
Cool. Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you. I mean, what a way to start the week. I'm really, really grateful.
Yes, I know. And you spoke over the amount of time, so we really appreciate your presence.
Yes.
And stayed around and answered a lot of questions. So big hugs when I see you. Thank you so much. Take care, everybody. Have a good rest of your week. Hopefully there's more programming that you will participate in for AAPI Heritage Month. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Really great. Thank you.